Hi, I'm Dana. I'm a mold maker here in Austin, Texas, and today I'm going to show you how I make a plaster mother mold in 4 parts over a silicone rubber mold. So I am using Puritan Pottery Plaster. Sometimes I will use Hydrocal, but this time I decided to use Puritan. So I start with a batch, I wait until it thickens enough that I can put it on with a brush. And then I brush on a layer on the whole area that I want to make a mold part for. Once I've got a layer on, I put the hemp fiber on, and as that plaster starts to thicken up, I use my hands a lot, and I smear in the hemp fiber, make sure it's good and embedded in that coat of plaster, and then I start to build up the flange around the edge, and that's going to allow me to clamp these parts together. On this particular mold, I am keeping the plaster even with the edge of the rubber. So the mother mold, instead of touching plaster to plaster, it's going to not touch plaster to plaster, if that makes sense. I'm scraping back that edge and keeping the mold rubber exposed. So it'll only be rubber keying into itself instead of plaster keying into itself. It's just a different way of doing it. I always say there's one right way to make a mold, and that's the way that works. So I like to try different things here and there and see what's efficient and what's going to work. And I think this is going to work really well. So I've got 2 parts made, and I'm ready to make the 3rd part. Again, brushing on that plaster once it gets a little bit thick. If you try to put it on too soon, it's all going to just run off the surface. So you have to be patient and wait for it. When I brush that on the surface, I am not pushing that brush into the surface. I'm using the brush almost like a trowel. That hemp fiber, I soak in water before I put it on there. If you put that dry hemp fiber in, it's going to absorb all the moisture out of your plaster and weaken it. You can see I use my hand like a squeegee. When I'm building up those thicker edges, I scrape the plaster off of my hand using the edge of the mold as a surface. If that makes sense, I just scrape little bits off, and then I go back with my plaster tool and clean it up and make it nice and pretty and clean edges. All right, final part here on the plaster. Again, brushing that on the surface. Once it's thickened up, putting the hemp fiber in. I make sure I have a nice layer of hemp fiber, but I don't want too much of it in there. I don't want big dry patches. Using my hands to smear that plaster down, and then again using my hands to trowel that flange on, and then coming back with the plaster tool and cleaning it up and making it square and scraping the edges down. All right, once that mold has set up, the plaster will get warm. Once it's warm, I can pry it off pretty easily. I'm using a Sureform rasp that I picked up at Home Depot, and that rasp is just to clean up those edges. I kind of scrape them down a little bit and get all the thin, flaky bits of plaster off, and then I often go back with a snap-off blade afterwards and really cut through, and that gets all of the stray hemp fiber off. All right, now it's time to cut the rubber mold. I am using a mold knife. This is a knife especially designed for cutting molds, and it has a divot in the middle of it. It's a very sharp knife, and it's got a divot. I made a mark that gives me an estimate of how deep I want to plunge that knife. And as I cut through, it makes a key in the flange that's going to allow those 2 parts to seat back against each other properly. I don't worry about the surface against the clay. I'm going to finish that with an X-Acto knife. So once I've cut through with the mold knife on the whole thing, then I go back in with the X-Acto or snap-off blade and finish the cut against the surface. And that gives me some amount of control as to where exactly I want that cut to land on the rubber. So once I've cut through with the mold knife, Then when I go back through with the X-Acto, I can angle the blade here and there to make sure that it lands really where I want it to land. And that's basically it. These parts will seat back nicely into the plaster, and then I can make castings in wax, plaster, resin, or whatever I want.